Romans chapter 9 is one of the most debated and challenging passages in the entire Bible. For centuries, scholars, theologians, and everyday readers have wrestled with its meaning, trying to understand what Paul was really saying about God's will and our own choices. Many people wonder, does God decide even before we are born who will be saved and who will not? Or do we have the freedom to choose our own path and respond to God's invitation? In Romans 9, Paul raises deep and sometimes unsettling questions about God's plan, human responsibility, and the mystery of divine election. Some readers believe these verses teach that God picks certain people for heaven and others for hell, all according to his own purpose, before they have done anything good or bad. But is that really what Romans 9 is saying, or is there more to the story than meets the eye? To find out, we need to carefully look at the Bible stories Paul refers to, stories about Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob and Esau, and Pharaoh. Each of these figures played a unique role in God's unfolding plan. Each story helps us understand what Paul means about God's purpose, his mercy, and how he works through history to accomplish his promises. Paul's message is not just about individuals, but about how God's plan includes all nations, breaking down barriers and opening the door for everyone, regardless of background or heritage. As we explore this chapter together, we'll discover that it's really about faith in Jesus Christ and that anyone, no matter who they are, can receive God's mercy and become part of his family. Paul begins Romans 9 by reflecting on the story of Abraham's sons, Isaac and Ishmael, two brothers whose lives would shape the destiny of nations. Both Isaac and Ishmael were sons of Abraham, sharing the same father and growing up under the same sky, but only Isaac was chosen to continue the special promise God had made. God's choice of Isaac wasn't about favoritism or personal merit. It was about the family line through which God would fulfill his promise to bring forth a great nation and ultimately a blessing for the whole world. Ishmael, though not the child of the covenant, was still deeply loved and blessed by God. God promised that Ishmael too would become the father of a great nation, showing that his care extended to both sons. The story isn't about who is accepted or rejected by God for eternity. Instead, it's about who would carry the story of God's promise forward, shaping the future of faith. In Genesis, we see God's compassion for both Isaac and Ishmael. He reassures Abraham that Ishmael will also become a great nation, but the unique covenant, the special relationship and promise, will continue through Isaac's descendants. God's choice was about the path of the promise, not about loving one son and rejecting the other. Both were part of God's larger plan, each with their own role and destiny. Paul uses this story to teach that being part of God's family isn't about ancestry, heritage, or human effort. It's not about who your parents are or what you achieve. The real focus is on God's faithfulness to his promises. It's about trusting that God's plan is bigger than our understanding, and that his love and purpose reach far beyond human boundaries or expectations. When people read Romans 9, they sometimes feel uneasy, wondering if God is truly fair in how he chooses people. The idea that God might favor some and not others can be troubling, raising deep questions about justice and mercy. But if we look closely at the stories behind Paul's words, we discover a much richer and more compassionate picture of God's character. For example, when Ishmael and his mother Hagar are sent away into the wilderness, it seems like they are abandoned. Yet God hears the boy's cries and responds with kindness, promising to make Ishmael into a great nation. Even though Isaac was chosen as the child of promise, Ishmael was not forgotten or cast aside. God's care extended to him as well. This shows that God's love and concern reach far beyond just one family line or chosen group. He cares for all people, regardless of their background. The choices God makes in these stories are about fulfilling specific roles and carrying out his plans, not about loving one person and rejecting another. Paul highlights this truth to remind us that God's plan is much bigger and more inclusive than we often imagine. In his letter to the Galatians, Paul writes, "Now you, brothers and sisters, like Isaac, are children of promise." This means that anyone who has faith can be included in God's family. This is a powerful invitation for everyone, no matter their heritage, to become part of God's story through faith. So the real question is not about being born into the right family or having the perfect background, but about trusting in God's promise and opening our hearts to his love and purpose. Paul uses the story of Isaac and Ishmael as a picture of two ways to approach God. Isaac represents the way of faith, receiving God's promise as a gift. Ishmael represents trying to achieve God's promise by human effort. Paul's point is not that God hates Ishmael, but that relying on our own strength cannot bring us into God's family. Romans 9 says, "It is not the children of the flesh who are children of God, but the children of the promise." God invites everyone to be part of his family through faith, not by trying harder. Anyone can be a child of God, not by birth or effort, but by believing in what God has done through Jesus. Next, Paul talks about Jacob and Esau, the twin sons of Isaac. God says, "The older will serve the younger." Unusual, since the older son usually gets the blessing. God chooses Jacob to carry the promise forward, but that's not about sending Esau to hell. God's choice was about roles in his plan, not about salvation or punishment. In the Bible, love and hate often mean choose and not choose for a special role. Esau became the father of a nation too, the Edomites. God's choice of Jacob was for a purpose, not to condemn Esau. This story is about how God sometimes works in surprising ways. Paul also talks about Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, during the Exodus. Sometimes Pharaoh hardened his own heart, and sometimes God hardened it. This means Pharaoh was responsible for his choices. God gave him many chances to let Israel go, but Pharaoh refused. Only after Pharaoh repeatedly rejected God did God confirm his decision. The hardening of Pharaoh's heart shows how people can resist God's mercy if they choose. God's patience gives everyone the chance to repent. So what is the main message of Romans chapter 9? Paul is not saying God picks people for salvation or loss with no choice for them. Instead, he shows that God's promise comes by faith, not ancestry, works, or human effort. Romans 9 sums it up. Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have obtained it by faith, but Israel pursued it by works and did not attain it. Anyone, Jew or Gentile, can receive God's mercy by faith. God's heart is open to all, and his choices in history were about his plan to bless the world through Jesus. Anyone who trusts Christ can be part of God's family, the hope of Romans 9. No one is left out if they choose to trust in Christ.